Again, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Patrick Stewart, and I'm the CEO of the San Diego Public Library Foundation. On behalf of the Library Foundation, the San Diego Public Library, and the Robert Frost Society, we're grateful to have you join us this afternoon. This inaugural event between the Foundation, the Library, and the Frost Society serves to publicly announce the Robert Frost Society's new permanent home at the San Diego Public Library. We couldn't be more pleased about this new partnership, and we look forward to years of insightful, enlightening, and entertaining opportunities to explore the humanities through Frost's work and to be able to introduce the power of poetry and language to a much broader audience. To learn more about this partnership and how to support the Foundation and the Frost Society, along with ways to get further involved in your library, please visit supportmylibrary.org. Now I'd like to introduce Amherst College alum, class of 1964, Bob Knox.
Thanks for the introduction, Patrick. And I just want to say a few brief words about the film you're about to see before we actually roll it, which is the main event. So in October of 1963, President Kennedy spoke at the groundbreaking for the new Robert Frost Library at Amherst College, where Frost had taught and inspired students on and off for decades. This documentary film tells the story of that remarkable speech, of information about the Kennedy-Frost connection and the broader consequences of this event. It was, sadly, Kennedy's last public speech. There are three panel members here, Amherst seniors on that glorious October day, who remember the event well. I'm one of them. We knew Frost. He was a famous poet, seminar leader. He was gray and rumpled professor on the campus. We were impressed that in spite of Cold War crises, the president of the United States still found time to visit Amherst and speak not about that war, but about Frost and poetry, the arts, politics, and power, a speech that some critics still view as his finest ever. And then just 27 days later, while we were savoring his visit, his memorable language, and his messages, came the shock of Dallas. Those days have lodged in our memories, unsurprisingly. Kennedy had challenged us to use our educational advantages towards public service, not just private gain. A remarkably large percentage of our classmates joined the Peace Corps immediately after graduation the next year, and others of us have answered Kennedy's challenge in many other ways. In 2014, we set ourselves a common theme of the world we inherited and the world we will leave behind for all of our 50th reunion programs. We intended to do more than just reminisce over beer, although we did plenty of that. One program element on the past and future of our American democracy resulted in this film you're about to see, a companion book and a website, all of the same name. We wanted to tell the Frost-Kennedy story as we had experienced it and been motivated by it and perceived its significance now 50 years later. We hope that key messages about politics, power, poetry, and the arts might not only resonate with those who remember October of 1963, but also inspire people not yet born. At Amherst, Kennedy connected a famous Frost couplet to the importance of arts and artists in a free society. He said, "But in a democratic society, the highest duty of the writer, the composer, the artist is to remain true to himself and let the chips fall where they may. In serving his vision of the truth, the artist best serves his nation. And the nation which disdains the mission of art invites the fate of Robert Frost's hired man, the fate of having nothing to look backward to with pride and nothing to look forward to with hope." Well, perhaps today, by paying attention to this poet and this president from the 1960s, their masterful use of language to convey their thoughts and values in unforgettable English, we can identify parts of our American experience that can lead today's viewers and readers, particularly younger ones, towards both legitimate pride and justifiable hope. And if so, our reunion project will have served its purpose. And now we hope you enjoy the film.
I think we can begin our discussion, and I'm going to invite members of our panel to turn on their cameras, turn on their microphones, and I think we have somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes available to us. And what I'm going to ask us to do first is to go around the virtual room and very briefly introduce ourselves. And then there was a Q&A provocation that came in. And I think that I would begin then afterwards by developing that provocation for our panelists. So we're going to go around the virtual room. I'm Seth Lehrer. I teach at the University of California at San Diego. I used to be Dean of Arts and Humanities there, and I've done a lot of different things in my career. I've worked on many different areas of British and American literature, the history of the English language, children's literature, and contemporary, as well as earlier poetry. And I've done a great deal of outreach work with the San Diego community and the San Diego Library in trying to bring visiting writers and the culture of literacy, not just for the larger community, but for many groups working in K-12 and with our border communities in San Diego. And so I'm just going to ask Robert Benedetti to briefly introduce himself, and then I'll call on people around the square.
I'm Robert Benedetti. I'm an emeritus professor from the University of the Pacific. I am a political scientist. I focus on state and local government, and I'm one of the class of 1964 at Amherst who witnessed that speech. I also was lucky enough to go to Kennedy's inaugural, so I saw two of his famous speeches, and have always been interested in the intersection of literature and politics.
Thank you, Bob. Bob Knox?
Yeah, I'm Bob Knox. I'm an emeritus research oceanographer and associate director at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UCSD. I've been, research scientist for a chunk of my career, and then the latter part of it, I was in charge of our fleet of research vessels and the technical support groups that are part and parcel of that effort at sea. Like Bob Benedetti, I was a class of 64 at Amherst. I was there the day that Kennedy spoke. I think my interest in this project has picked up more, perhaps in more recent years, as I've tried to think with Bob Benedetti and Neil Bicknell and others about ways and means to bring forward in time some of what you saw and hopefully took away as messages from the film. And I would point you to the associated book and the website. Try to bring those things forward into the minds of people who are students today, not students in 1963 as we were. That's good enough for me, I think.
Thank you, Bob. Ruth Ellen? You need to unmute yourself again.
You did.
Thank you for that. I'm Ruth Ellen Coker, and today is my first day of freedom and emancipation from my contracts at the University of Colorado, serving as chair of English, divisional dean for the arts and humanities, and then senior associate dean for strategic programs consecutively. And I'm free, so now I am simply professor of English here. And I would have to add that I was born in 1965. And in some ways, I am a product of this social service idealism that moved into the 70s and went into the schools and went into housing projects and educated kids like me and planted the seeds of this kind of liberal arts canon. This is Shakespeare, this is the art of mass, this is photography, so that then we kind of brought that tradition of education and social service, I think, into broader working class communities and communities with more diverse cultures.
Thank you. Neil?
My name is Neil Bicknell. I had the privilege of working with a terrific group of classmates in creating the film and the companion book. I worked as the executive producer of the film. My career was in finance on Wall Street, but I've always been engaged in civic activities. Served on the village board and other civic organizations in Scarsdale, New York, and have a particular concern with the state of our democracy and feel that the Kennedy and Frost messages that are included in the film and in other works of both of these gentlemen have a particular message for us relative to the current state of our democratic system and our polarized politics. And we would very much like to see these messages carried forward to this generation's young people, as well as the broader public.
Thank you, Neil. Carla, could you unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. My name is Carla Cordero. I am a poet, a professor, proudly serving as associate faculty at San Diego State University, City College, and Miracosta College, teaching in the letters department and within the realms of Chicano studies, creative writing, and literature. I am also the CFO and social justice equity coordinator for a nonprofit in Oceanside called Glassless Minds, an art space and open mic serving our historically under-resourced youth. And thank you all so much for tuning in.
Thank you. And Bob Haas?
Hi, I'm Bob Haas. I'm a professor of English at Edinburgh University, which helped sponsor this evening. I'm executive director of the Frost Society. I'm a poet and a literary critic. I'd like to just take a moment to thank the San Diego Public Library Foundation, Reunion 64 Inc., which made the film presentation possible, and all of our distinguished panelists here. It's a star-studded field, and it's really my privilege to be among you, and I really am very grateful to all of you for helping kick off the Robert Frost's new home in San Diego with this event. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. Elisa? Elisa?
Yes, I'm Elisa New. I'm a professor of American literature at Harvard and the director and host of the Poetry in America television series that airs on PBS. Our third season, coming up in January, will include an episode featuring my colleague and friend Jay Parini, who's in all the Frost films, as he ought to be. That episode focuses on the poem. We saw great animation of Mending Wall, and includes among the discussants Jay, who has the last word in our film too. You're very good at the last word, Jay. And David Gergen, counselor to many presidents, novelist Julia Alvarez, who is Jay's neighbor, Rina Espaillat, who translated Frost into Spanish, Tracy K. Smith, former recent US poet laureate, and I hope I'm not leaving anybody out, and Ambassador Caroline Kennedy, who was not at the inauguration. She was sleeping at home, she tells me, but she does, for a moment in our interview, talk about the great Amherst speech, and we feature a little bit of it too. I'd be delighted to screen the film in San Diego if you all are interested when it airs.
Thank you. And Jay?
Hello, everybody. I'm Jay Parini, and it's lovely to be on this panel with my friends Lisa and Bob Haas and Neil, and to have participated in this film. I've seen it several times, and it never ceases to amaze me how this intersection of poetry and power, the political and the poetic, really have an intersection that amplify each other, and it seems so endlessly relevant. I've myself been teaching poetry and literature at Middlebury and Dartmouth for 48 years, still teaching full time. And I wrote a biography of Robert Frost, came out about 20 years ago, and I spent 25 years working on that book. And so, but I never for a second ever tire of going back to Frost, the energy in his language, the clarity of his vision, and the depth of his humanity always startle me.
Thank you. Well, it's a remarkable panel. And as I say, we don't have a great deal of time, but I think for those of us who've seen this film, I saw it earlier, and this is my second time viewing it. What emerges is really a constellation of issues: poetry and power, but also the place of the liberal arts in an undergraduate education. What is the relationship, not just between the arts and the sciences, but what I would suggest is how today many of us who are professional educators and many of us who are in lifelong learning activities, what is the role of poetry? What is the role of the arts? What is the role in fostering the creative imagination? And I'm going to exercise my prerogative as moderator to actually call on someone. And I'm going to ask Carla, because I know that in your social activism work, in your work in the San Diego community, that you are in many ways approaching the relationship between the imagination and political action in ways that may be very different from what we saw in this film, but I'd like to believe are complementary. And I'm wondering if you could lead us off with that kind of insight.
Absolutely, and thank you, Seth, for a culmination of wonderful questions and thoughts. But I immediately am drawn to Audre Lorde's work, how she talks about the philosophy of the European way of thinking, and that is, I think, therefore I am. But Audre Lorde calls us to say, I feel, therefore I'm free, and how poetry is the language that creates the vehicle for this revolutionary act. And so when we think about poetry and power and giving access and equity to our communities, especially our historically under-resourced, our marginalized voices and so forth, is we think about poetry doing three things. How one, poetry can be a door that opens and gives folks access to resources and art so they can see themselves in the world, and they can then create and archive their own stories. How poetry can then be a mirror, a reflective self to see themselves, and the importance of being in tune with humanity. Because a lot of times we are constantly working to kind of create a series of survival in whichever goals we desire, but to stay in tune with our humanity is the most important part. And Kennedy calls it, not just the strength of a nation, but the spirit, and how humanity is just as important to keep art very close to the heart. And three, to think about poetry as a window. And when we can change the perspective and angle of how we see the world, this then creates an opportunity for educating folks about the oppressions, as well as the celebrations of various communities and cultures. And two, thinking about poetry as allyship, when we can use the language beyond its literal understanding and use figurative language as metaphors and similes to show these correlations of oppression and hardship and celebration, we can create allyship within that journey. So,
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, so thank you so much, but different ways we can view poetry and use it as those vehicles.
Carla, that is wonderful. And I would like to use that as a springboard to ask Bob Benedetti and Bob Knox and Neil to reflect on what you said. And the way that I'm going to ask them is, if any of you saw President Biden's inauguration with Amanda Gorman's poetic presentation, and how you would see that in terms of what we've seen here with Frost and Kennedy. Would any of you like to reflect on that? And I'm asking the alumni in particular, since many of you have this lived, vivid experience as you've talked about, and then maybe open it up. And that was one of the Q&A points about Ms. Gorman's presentation. Any thoughts on this, Bob Knox?
Let me think. I think, first of all, just the simple fact that Amanda Gorman was there on that stage at a presidential inaugural has more than a few echoes of Frost being the first to be in a similar situation. And thank goodness we've come back around to that sort of pairing of a political event and an artistic event. I thought it was wonderful, just listening to her. I thought it was outstanding. And beyond that, I haven't thought much more deeply, but I just had this feeling that, oh boy, I've seen this movie in some respects before, and it's good to see it again.
Right, that's exactly the kind of thing I'm trying to get at. Neil, do you feel the same way as Bob Knox? You need to unmute, Neil.
Yes, I do. It was really gratifying to see that replay. And it's interesting the connection here. When President Kennedy spoke to us about our responsibility to serve the public interest, he said we should do so not only contributing our talent, but also contributing our sympathy, our understanding, and our compassion. And it seems to me that that's what the vehicle of poetry helps us appreciate and is a way to share those sentiments.
I think that's wonderful. Ruth, may I, if you'll excuse me, Ruth Ellen, I know your poetry. I know you as a poet, not
Yes.
as a university administrator.
I know,
But
it's a strange
as a
thing how that happens, isn't it?
I know.
And I will
As a
say,
poet,
you know, my first day in the
Can you
dean's
respond to
office-
what the gentlemen are saying?
Yes, and my first day in the dean's office, my colleague who is a dean said, you know, you're such, well, not my first day, after about a month, you're such a good dean, you don't seem at all poety, right? And and it's funny because I completely agree with Carla in terms of the way poetry works in community. It is a series of systems built around voice and narrative. And it's kind of funny that we're talking about poetry and power because, you know, I'm thinking about this from my background or my point of view. I come from a white working class community. I was the only Black body. So it's like the growing up poor story, but with poor white people. And so I had white privilege, which meant that I had access, right, not to monetary resources, but to education and the legacy of language and literature and all of those things that are not taught in all schools, right? But we do have a tendency to, well, at least then in the early 70s, we were still teaching poor white kids about poetry. And so I think about the way that there was almost a transmutation through this generation in that the speech at Amherst was a speech to the educational elite of the country. You know, the actual last speech in Fort Worth was not a great speech, and it wasn't a great speech because it was to the Fort Worth community. It was to
This is the
function
Kennedy
of
last.
labor.
This is the actual Kennedy last speech. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a function of labor. He talked about the military and Fort Worth's role in keeping the country safe. And it's interesting because I think the speech in Fort Worth illustrates the disconnect between Kennedy and Frost when they had that disconnect. Because for Frost, the capital T truth of the poem is absolute. So he doesn't realize that Kennedy's like, yes, this is a very good value. However, when it comes down to it, the mechanization of America and assigning and siloing tasks and purpose for people, these people were meant to produce helicopters, was still something he exercised as president. And that's why he was so surprised. Why would Frost say that? And Frost thinks, why is he offended?
I think that's really important. Elissa New, could I invite you, since I hope you understand, I think of you really, you know, the omphalos, you know, really at the navel of this whole story. And how has, the way I want to ask it is,
Because of why? Why?
Well, I think both of us, you know, many of us have been in this business for a very long time. We've seen a lot change. And I think part of the lesson of this film is things change, but there are things that will stay the same. There are verities. And I want to ask you briefly, what's changed, what's stayed the same in your liberal arts mission?
You changed the very ending of the sentence. I thought, what has changed and what has stayed the same in my liberal arts mission? My liberal arts mission has, I think, come around more to Frost's, where Frost, I love that moment where Frost addresses these kids and says in colleges, we're generalists, and in universities, they make the mistake of becoming specialists. And I think that that specialization is what Ruth Ellen was talking about too, kind of disassembly of the integrated human being. And actually Carla was talking about that too. And so the academic turn that installed poetry as a subject of research put poetry in a place where one wouldn't have predicted Amanda Gorman, certainly 15 years ago or 20 years ago, except that something extraordinary was happening. And that is that teenagers and committed teenagers were discovering this old technology and discovering some of the oldest, returning to oral poetry, returning to poetry in the spotlight, returning to chorus, bringing back, and rhyme. When I grew up, rhyme was so passé. And I began to notice something going on with my young children in the 90s who were reciting poetry along with early hip hop in the car. And so there has been this extraordinary groundswell that has come from the young that delivered Amanda Gorman into, I was also looking at those old guys, all those old white guys on the podium at that inauguration. Aside from the whiteness, the youth that we saw there, and the youthfulness that thought of poetry as a civic instrument. I'm not sure
that's
that
great.
Question set.
That is such a great phrase. Poetry as a civic instrument. That's perfect. Can I ask Bob Haas? Poetry is a civic instrument. Would you like to run with that?
Sure. There's a backstory here to the Kennedy-Frost relationship, and it was spoken to in the movie, where when Frost got off the plane after returning from the Soviet Union, he attributed language to Khrushchev that Khrushchev never spoke, something about the United States and Kennedy being too liberal to fight. And that language offended Kennedy, who was not about to have American resolve questioned during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he treated Frost rather badly toward the end of his life. He didn't speak to Frost at the end of his life. Even Bobby Kennedy, for example, issued Frost well wishes at the end of his life in the hospital. But if you compare that response to what was happening in the Soviet Union, Frost dined with the poet Anna Akhmatova when he was in Russia. Anna Akhmatova was only able to dine with Frost because she had already begun to kind of rehabilitate herself in the eyes of the Politburo. So she was writing these rather horrible, servile poems celebrating Stalin because her son was imprisoned and she feared for his life because she had lost 2 other husbands in the gulags at the time. And, so that's the kind of response that the Soviets had to its poets and its intellectuals. It was far harsher treatment. And so that's the problem with the authoritarian regime. The authoritarian regime controls discourse, even artistic discourse. And if poets aren't towing the party line, then they're suppressed or worse. And what Kennedy is demanding in his speech is that poets have an obligation to speak to the failures of a nation, to call those failures out so that we can do better. And so, you know, I think that's what Kennedy is asking for. I think that's an obligation of poetry and poets. You know, Akhmatova's beautiful poem, Requiem, which she composed while her family was imprisoned, was part of the Samizdat movement, right? You know, you could only surreptitiously convey these poems to your friends without publication because of fear of repercussion. And she wasn't allowed to publish that poem, or that poem never came to light in Russia until 1987. And in in the introduction to that poem, you know, a woman in line for the prison, or waiting in the prison line to hear word from a family member, asks her, "Can you describe this?" And she says, "Yes." And that's the obligation of the poet.
Can I ask Jay Parini to follow up on the obligation of the poet? Jay, you've done so much in not just Frost work, but in literary biography and really in understanding the poet's social role in America. Would you like to take Bob Haas's provocation about the obligation of the poet?
Well, one thing we haven't really dwelled on much is the fact that Frost was an ordinary man. He was a farmer, and he began writing poetry while being a farmer, chicken farmer in Derry, New Hampshire, and going into the general store every day and listening to the farmers talk. And he was able to cull poetry from what he called the sound of sense, ordinary speech. And I think there's a direct line that can be drawn from, say, Frost, the ordinary man speaking to the nation, voice of the people, to Amanda Gorman. Frost is not an elitist. Frost is your ordinary farmer poet in a sense. I mean, it's a bit of a role he takes on, but he is grounding his poetry, which is great traditional poetry, but he's grounding it in the speech of the common man. And I think, and woman, I think Frost was able to embody the role of poet in a kind of emblematic way, which never loses its vitality. And I think Amanda Gorman would probably even say, sure, she could trace her own roots back to Frost being one of the first public poets who was willing to go out and stand and speak truth to power again and again, but because representing the ordinary values of humanity.
I think that's wonderful. Can I ask Bob Benedetti to come back and reflect on our conversation in terms of your memory of the experience that we've watched, but also now, so many years later, the resonance and the relevance of this?
Well, I think one of the things that the movie highlights is how much both Frost and Kennedy opened up our class to other people, to empathizing with other places and other times, to looking at other parts of our society that we might not have done before. So it was kind of an awakening, an attempted awakening of the elite. You mentioned Miss Gorman, and we've mentioned the poetry movement among the youth. I think what that's done is given the common people their own voice. Frost gave it to them, but and he was in some ways of them. But a lot more people, I think, now have the poetic tools to be able to express themselves. And I think that the difference maybe between Frost and Gorman is that Gorman was a call to action of other people to become poets, where Frost was trying to open up the elite to poetry. And I think that Gorman is celebrating this wonderful movement of people getting interested in and adopting the language of the poet to be able to talk. They don't need other poets to filter. They are able to talk themselves.
I think that is a wonderful point. May I ask Carla to take up on this? And I hope you understand I'm asking this genuinely. Do you work in bilingual and multilingual communities? And if you do, what do we mean by common language in your communities? And we're talking about Frost really as the American English vernacular, but he has a lesson for what is changing about the American language.
Absolutely. So I've definitely done a lot of work with undocumented migrants and creating platforms for them to tell their stories. I've done a lot of work with our youth and exposing them to the humanities and the arts and how they too can tell their stories. So a lot of times we have our youth really intimidated by poetry because they see it as this kind of elitist platform for using language that they don't see themselves in. So a lot of times when we're talking about you have access, you have what's called cultural capital. You have language already possessed in the body, whether it be your dialects, colloquialisms, the stories that you have to tell the stories that need to be as authentic and as true to your own identity. So when we think about, John F. Kennedy saying, we are in a new era where poetry is the vehicle for telling truth. It's a vehicle to use language to also talk about poetry as a movement for imagining possibility. And so how can we use language to rewrite and rescript and reclaim these stories that are being told?
I think that's wonderful. I want to turn to Bob Knox because Bob, I don't think I ever met you when I was Dean of Arts and Humanities, but certainly one of the challenges I had at UCSD, which is a famous STEM school, was to make the case for arts and humanities, and also to make the case for a school that in many ways had oceanography as its core, the Scripps Institute as really the heart of it. And what I love about your experience is that you're an ocean scientist with a poetic sensibility. And I'm wondering how, I guess what I'm saying is, could you have done my job? How would you make the case as an ocean scientist?
Well, the
for
short
the kinds
answer,
of things that Carla is saying.
the short answer, could I have done your job, is unequivocally no.
This is why I'm not doing my job anymore. You understand, Bob?
But I guess it's part of my upbringing and the Amherst part of it in particular that leads to at least an appreciation, not a noted practitioner, but at least an appreciation of the liberal arts background. As you heard in the film, we all, Benedetti, Bicknell, and myself and all the others, got forced through a fairly rigidly structured liberal arts curriculum in the first year, particularly in second and 2 years, really, before we were cut free to, in my case, major in physics and so on. And that stuck. I mean, as Tom Jacobs said in the film, we were talking about the latest set of physics problems in the chow line going in for meals because everybody was facing the same thing. So there was that forced aspect of broadening, if you will, and learning from each other to a considerable degree. I mean, we're talking about a class of 270 of us in the class, something of that order. Small college, clearly. How you translate any of that into a mega university like UCSD is a really hard problem, and I'm not about to take on being a dean of humanities. I get it, and all I could do in that context at UCSD myself in retirement is to try to beat the drum for, student by student as I encounter them. One of my favorite mantras, if you will, to the Chancellor Scholars kids that I mentor is you got a Chancellor Scholarship, you've got some financial slack, you're coming in with lots of AP credits. For heaven's sakes, if you can make it work, don't bolt out of here in 3 years or 3.5 years. Take advantage of the full 4 and do some other stuff, okay? And set your horizons broader. And maybe 1 or 2 of the computer science guys will have actually taken me up on that. I don't know.
I think that's great. Can I ask Ruth Ellen, we're both at large public universities, and yet we've seen a film that's very much about the small liberal arts college sensibility. How does this film, for example, help us think of ways of bringing some of what Bob is saying to the big public university? You need to unmute again.
I'd say it exists at the large university, but it exists in, you know, those divisions, the arts and humanities. I will say this, that more and more large universities are understanding the necessary investment in the arts and humanities in their STEM fields. Our College of Engineering has their own kind of pilot arts and humanities like division. But I think that, to be honest with you, it's at the larger universities where you have poets, sometimes many poets. You know, I am in a creative writing department of 7 or 8 faculty, and we are the generator sometimes of this kind of developing, burgeoning canon that's extensive and that embraces a larger scope, right, than the kind of elite canon. So, for example, you know, Gwendolyn Brooks is publishing at this time as well, first Black woman to win a Pulitzer Prize. And so Amanda Gorman, in some ways, for me, is not a surprise at all, because I have seen the constellation that goes from Gwendolyn Brooks to Rita Dove to Evie Shockley to Natasha Trethewey to Tracy K. Smith to Amanda Gorman, and Elizabeth Alexander is in there as the inaugural poet for President Obama. And she gets eclipsed to a certain extent because I think we have a Black president, a Black poet inaugurating, and there's a certain expectation. But if you look at Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem, I strongly feel that in some ways it is a response and a reaction to Elizabeth Alexander's inaugural poem, because we thought we had opened this door and arrived somewhere, and we were all very jarred at how easily that can slip from our fingers, the sense of secure democracy and freedom. And that's coming from someone who has never had secure democracy and freedom in this country, because I'm a biracial woman born in 1965 when it was illegal. I'm contraband. And so, you know, this idea of power for me, from my perspective, it's a matter of empowerment. And I think Carla understands that. And to be honest with you, I don't know if either Frost or Kennedy understood what happens when that empowerment of poetry is seeded and grows out of communities where people do not have power, right?
Yes, I see that. Elisa, do you see what Ruth Ellen is saying as well about, you talk about undergraduates and all?
I'm thinking about interdisciplinarity. I'm actually back on the question you asked Bob Knox. And a question that Ruth Ellen actually answered when she said at big universities, there are poets on various kinds of frontiers. In some ways, you're under less supervision and you range more widely. You're needed in more places. And I can say that in my in my work as a director and host of a television series that tries to make poetry accessible and fun and delightful without compromising depth, the very best tool I have is to put an ocean scientist in conversation with a poem to leverage what that ocean scientist knows. So in season 2, we did have 6 marine scientists reading Marianne Moore's The Fish.
That's wonderful.
And they explained things about the fish that I didn't know. And in season 3, we have astrophysicists helping us to read A.R. Ammons, Archie Ammons. And so there is the power of our adjacency, of our exposure to diverse fields, diverse peoples. You know, I'm always thinking about, on the one hand, the way voice means self-discovery, self-expression, identity, right? The excavation and freeing of identity. But poetry is so powerful as well when it delivers us into a world that's completely unfamiliar to us, when it makes the unfamiliar familiar, and whether it's a social, whether it does so socially by exposing us to people we had never thought about, or whether somehow the lens of the poem or the lens of another field on the poem enlarges our vision. And so it seems to me Frost was there in his grouchy, truculent, performative, grousing about universities versus colleges, and that in some ways the Amherst ethos of interdisciplinarity and of the liberal arts, is a
Yes,
fountain of that as well. Thank you for helping me finish the sentence.
absolutely. Listen, my friends, this is such a remarkable conversation. As my therapist likes to say, I'm afraid we're out of time. But I just want to thank all of you. We could go on forever. This has been a unique group and a unique opportunity. Patrick Stewart, can I invite you to wrap up?
Absolutely. Seth, thank you so much. And I want to extend some very sincere gratitude to all of our panelists who are with us this evening. A quick thank you to the Reunion 64 Inc. group, the Edinburgh University, the donors and supporters of the San Diego Public Library Foundation and of the Robert Frost Society for assisting and sponsoring this evening's event. Again, I want you all to know that we're very grateful to all of you for joining us, and I encourage you to visit supportmylibrary.org to learn more about the Library Foundation, the Robert Frost Society, and how your support keeps programs like this going. Thank you very much, and good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.